I was really excited for Shadow Generations like many people were. When the project was revealed to be built off of the last Sonic game's framework, Sonic Frontiers' framework, but more polished and packaged in with Sonic Generations, yeah, you could say I was pretty excited to see what they were planning. Turns out, it lived up to my expectations. Finally, it's here. Now, I want to preface this by saying I am no game designer or video game critic. I will be talking about my experience with the video game and conveying it to the best of my small abilities. Oh, also, don't worry, this video won't contain any spoilers of the sort. With that out of the way, I don't want this to just be a retrospect on my experience with the game. I want it to also be a focus on the future of the Sonic series with this game in mind. And wow, this game really did a good job at feeling like a genuine collection celebrating both Sonic and Shadow's histories. The collection room from Sonic Generations also returns to Shadow Generations, but whereas you got goodies from Red Star Rings, in Shadow Generations there are some replacements for it, and when you get said replacements, it encourages you to go into the open zone to find the chests and get these goodies. I honestly spent so much time in the collection room, it was genuinely a vibe. I really enjoyed looking at the art here. Speaking of which, we also have a digital art book and mini soundtrack, which I don't know if it was just me, but I literally could not play music while browsing through the art book. Either that's a really weird choice or I'm just slow. I, for one, generally speaking, think this game did a good job at encouraging you to play with both the open zone formula and traditional levels. As for how Shadow controls, yeah, he controls strange. It is literally just Frontier Sonic, but worse. But I won't lie, turning in this game definitely felt weird and a bit sensitive. It took a tiny bit of getting used to for me, but I got it down at some point, especially with the boost. I've seen people say that he's floaty, which I definitely agree with. It creates a stark contrast between the two games, with Sonic controlling like a tank and Shadow being more floaty. However, I actually prefer Sonic Generations physics and controls. It just feels more right to me. But I can say Sonic Frontiers' controls definitely are better than both of them. Shadow definitely does not control nearly as well as Sonic did in Frontiers, especially in the open zone. Frontier Sonic, just in general, the entire game's experience just went up because of his controls alone. But yeah, overall, this literally is just a good timeline version of Sonic Forces mixed in with Sonic Frontiers. This game is very similar to Sonic Forces, but you know, actually good. That goes for the game's design philosophy too. The homing attack is also a massive improvement from Sonic Frontiers. It feels way more spammy. I do wish we just had the option to just have straight up no hit stop though. Regardless, the whole game feels very responsive, which I like. The Stomp also removed that bounce effect that Sonic Frontiers had, which is fair. With levels as tight as these, the Stomp shouldn't really bounce up. But if there's one thing I'm sad about, it's the lack of drift. Again, it makes sense given the context of this game, as there are more open levels that wouldn't have the drift fit exactly well. But man, the drift was really fun. Would I sacrifice these more openly designed levels for the sake of a drift? Yeah, no, I really like the way these levels are designed and prefer them way more than the traditional boost style gameplay. About what I said earlier, these levels managed to retain the design philosophy of the original games that they're from, but at the same time still feeling fresh and new. Like, Sunset Heights feels like an actual level from Sonic Forces, except good. For a while in the community, many were skeptical as to what the level design would be like in Shadow Generations. When we got our first gameplay reveal, many people claimed that the game just didn't look fun and was filled with way too many empty hallways and looked like you would be playing in a straight line. Of course, when I look for a boost Sonic game, I'm not looking for anything particularly hard or difficult, and I don't mind periods of time with just quote-unquote straight lines. That is, as long as they're engaging and constantly keep me looking ahead. The problem with Sonic Forces was that it was too safe. You were never given much challenges as modern Sonic. I mean, just look at the first level. The enemies don't even attack you. Also, Sonic Forces was just not visually engaging. It never kept me on edge like a game like Unleashed or Generations does. Those brief QTE sequences are there for a reason, but they're just not there in Forces. It also didn't have much options for alternate pathways, making it really unfun to replay. In In general, speaking of which, replayability is one of the most important factors in a Sonic game. It's what decides what can keep a game fun after a month, year, or years after a game releases. If a Sonic game isn't fun to replay, then that's a big issue, which is why I replayed this game a couple of times before writing this review. Prior to this game's release, the head of Sonic Team, Takashi Iizuka, said in an interview that the game would have more alternate pathways than any Sonic game ever, which was an insane idea to even think about. Of course, alternate pathways are useless if they don't serve any purpose to the overall levels. You know, more risky pathways to take should have a bigger and more fulfilling reward. This design philosophy has retained since even the first ever Sonic game. So, did they do it? Did they add meaningful pathways and a fun and engaging level design structure? Honestly, yeah. Even within the first few seconds of Space Colony Arc Act 1, you're rushed with excitement as there are multiple pathways here to optimize your playtime. Not gonna lie, at times it sort of got overwhelming. Like, I straight up didn't know where to go and which path to take. It was really fun to replay. That's my biggest word of advice to anyone looking to play this game. Replay it a lot. There's so much here to do and explore. Wait, where's the Knight's Head and Radical Highway? Never mind, this level design sucks. Anyways, I am of the belief that combat is not exactly necessary in the traditional sense for Sonic games. Don't get me wrong, is it cool seeing Sonic go full on Dragon Ball and Aliens? Yes, of course. Was it good? Personally, I did not like Sonic Frontiers' combat. I found it way too spammy and repetitive, and frankly, it felt like it was lacking a lot of depth. So, what did Shadow Generations do to fix these criticisms and problems many have had with the Sonic Frontiers' combat? They did it. They just did it. Obviously, you won't see Shadow out here throwing hands as Sonic did in Frontiers. This is a very different type of game, which I do acknowledge. But I gotta say, Frontiers' gameplay style or not, I do agree with this approach to combat in the Sonic the Hedgehog series much, much more. Let's talk about all of the powers that you can use in Shadow Generations. Firstly, Chaos Control. I love Chaos Control. The way it's used here is brilliant and fits into the level design so well. There are just sections where the game is begging you to use Chaos Control, and I agree, they're great. Though, one minor issue I have with this is that the game relies a bit too much on Chaos Control. You're encouraged to essentially spam it as, for some reason, it stops your in-game timer. So if you're looking to get the best time and score, then you need to spam it. Now, is this the same in Time Trial? Somehow, yes, which is the stupidest idea ever and completely screws up time trials. Really hoping they change this as soon as possible. And I've gotta say, Chaos Control is filled by attacking more enemies, which means sometimes, if you're not out here doing cool skips or speed runs, you might want to take the lower pathways with enemies. Some people have said this is a better approach to the game, as you're encouraged to also look out for enemies and attack them more. But in my opinion, I feel like you should always be encouraged more to take the faster routes rather than go after the enemies. Doom powers are really fun and the game's main gimmick, but I can't help but feel that they don't sell the game. Like, the Doom powers are the main gimmick, trying to separate the game from other Sonic games, but I can't help but feel like we've done this before. This entire game honestly feels like that. It doesn't really try to do anything new or different, well, aside from the open zone, because if there's one difference this game has from the Boost games, Frontiers more so, it's the open zone, because unlike Frontiers, there aren't rails flying in the sky or the weirdest design decisions I've ever seen. It feels like the elements of these levels actually, you know, flow in with the environment well, like it should, but yeah, the game doesn't really feel like it stands apart all too well. The Doom Wings I like, but they're really overpowered, especially on Kingdom Valley Act 1, where I spent a quite amount of time using it. I managed to skip like all of Kingdom Valley Act 1 with the Doom Wings. Thankfully the game lets you disable it, but yeah, the Doom Wings really do act as the game's super form, but they can actually be negated with the next Doom power, Doom Spears. I really like Doom Spears because of the cool tech you can do with them, where if you spam them, essentially, you can keep your momentum while running. It adds some nice depth where while you're playing you need to look out for what types of enemies there are and whether or not you should Doom Blast them or spear them or just attack them normally. And these honestly negate the Doom Wings because with the Doom Spears you can actually go faster than using the Doom Wings if you manage to use it right. But that's the thing that's separating this with Doom Wings. Doom Wings is less skill based, but Doom Spears you actually need to put in that extra effort if you want to reach that extra speed. Of course, I don't really think that the Doom Spears are really that good on its own because I'm pretty sure the tech you can do with the Doom Spears isn't really intended, and they probably just forgot to add on the air drag to the Doom Spears. Doom Morph has also been pretty controversial. Some people hate it, some people love it, but some people say that those hating on it just have a skill issue. I'm a bit in the middle of the whole debate. The problem with the Doom Morph isn't that it's hard to use. In fact, it's quite easy to use if you know how to use it. But that's my problem. It's only easy if you know how to use it. But the game does a horrible job explaining it. You see, there are certain sections where you need to go straight up with the Doom Morph. The way the game tells you how to do this is by holding the X button. But that's just a straight up lie. What you actually need to do is let go of the X button once you reach the bottom of Morph's line thing. Doom Morph is honestly really fun once you get the hang of it, and I encourage people to learn it and utilize it more, because yeah, the game needed to explain that better, I feel. Oh, there's also Doom Surf, which sometimes I forget the difference between that and Doom Morph, but Doom Surf, I mean, this is there. They use it a lot in the Metal Overlord boss fight, and to be honest, it's pretty simple gameplay wise. It's literally just press the R button or L button. Of course, there's more to that. The steering is interesting and it helps me, but I feel like these sections are very, very short. The only time it's used well is in Metal Overlord. But by far, the biggest improvement this game has above any Sonic game really is it being the most engaging Sonic game from its presentation. It's honestly eye candy. The game makes Sonic Frontiers look like crap. And yeah, I don't want to hear anyone say ever again that Sonic Frontiers and Forces had good presentation. Yeah, after this game, nope, none of it. Especially when it comes to the animation. Frontiers had cool moments with its animation, but it was consistently mid or in between. Definitely not nearly as close to AAA standards these days. And to be honest, this game still isn't quite there, but it's really good presentation-wise. In general, Sonic Team has finally done the bare minimum and unlocked the FPS of the game on the PC port. Not like I got to experience that luxury as I am stuck on the Switch version. The game is great performance-wise though. I barely experienced FPS drops on Shadow Generations, except for here and there on Space Colony Arc Act 1 and Radical Highway. And I'm talking about the Switch port here. They really outdid themselves with the optimization of this game on the Switch. That can't exactly be said for glitches, because Shadow Generations doesn't have glitches, but Sonic Generations' remaster is full of them. I'm not sure if these were carried on from the original game or some of these were new, but they really just did not bother fixing a lot of things, including well, I think it's best that I just show you them. But anyways, I'm not going to talk about the game's animation much here. I'll save that for the story section of the video. For some reason, the game has pretty controversial music. You know what? At this point, I'm convinced music is the most subjective form of art out there. One's man trash is literally another's treasure when it comes to music. But not much I personally feel the need to discuss here, but I guess I liked it. The Sunset Heights remix is amazing and easily a highlight. Same with Chaos Island Act 1. But like I said, Chaos Island Act 1 is more on the subjective side. Most people think it's bad, but I kind of vibe with it. I think we can all agree Chaos Island Act 2's music is great, including the game's title screen. But wow, going into this game, I was expecting a pretty dark and serious story. What we got instead was basically no story. Well, saying that is a bit disingenuous. You see, the story here is like Frontiers, it's just okay for me. I like the game's story, but it has one major problem I see barely anyone talking about, which is strange, but we'll get to that soon. Now, I have to say, this is easily the best dialogue and characterization from Ian Flynn. The characters do feel like the actual characters. The jokes here feel like actual jokes and not just Marvel humor. We really are moving on from that MCU humor and over-reliance on jokes, as well as MCU-style dialogue in general. I'm not sure if the comics are doing that. I haven't read the comics in months, but who knows. Now, I'm not going to be talking about the game's prologue story, Dark Beginnings. That whole thing has been talked about a lot, and I don't feel like I could add much to the conversation. But what I will say is, I love what it sets up for Shadow Generations. It does a good job cementing the seeds for the game's theme and character conflict. This is also the first Sonic game in a long time without major lore inconsistencies popping up every second. Yeah, I know we were in the trenches. But hey, there's only one retcon here, and some minor errors if we don't count the Generations rewrite. This retcon being the can of worms that were opened up when it was revealed the fake Chaos Emerald is somehow still there. Correct me if I was wrong, but didn't the fake Chaos Emerald disintegrate into the Eclipse Cannon? How is it still here? Whatever, let's talk about how the game is told, because like I said earlier, this is the best looking Sonic game, and that includes the animations. The animations are easily the best in the series. There's almost never a dull moment in the cutscenes. You can tell the animations were made with attention to detail in mind. The way that every single part of these characters move is honestly just so seamless. The game actually looks AAA. Well, it's not exactly there yet compared to some of the better ones, but it's definitely a step in the right direction. If I have to say that again next game, I'm actually just gonna give up. That also goes for how the animations portray the characters. I love the way that Shadow hesitates or interacts to get close to Maria. The sheer expression he makes seeing Gerald Robotnik. This really gets across Shadow's feelings of confliction on Gerald. How despite he's done some good things, he's also done some awful things. Honestly, this would have been perfect if it wasn't for one thing. And I know this has been talked about all the time, but it is seriously time for new Sonic models. When this is the biggest expression your character can make when he's in pain, yeah, we kind of need an overhaul with the whole thing. And I think that really goes to show what the game's renders. Because Maria and Gerald's models are great. And I'm pretty sure that's because they're new. But even then, they still feel sort of held back. Like, if they were too good, you know, it would make the other characters look off. Anyways, but like I said about the renders, these characters really do feel like they're being held back. Shadow, Sonic, they all look great here, but the lighting here is just carrying these renders. Like, on their own, it's not really like visually distinct or stylized here. But also, can I take this time to rant about this Sonic render? I seriously hate this Sonic render. They should have honestly swapped poses for classic Sonic and modern Sonic here, because why is modern Sonic? I know that everyone has said this before, but he seriously just looks like a friend from work. Anyways, but unfortunately it looks like we're not getting new models anytime soon, since it looks like Marza has switched to the new models in the series. Now, I don't see a lot of people discussing this, but Sonic X Shadow Generations as a whole has one goal: to be a beginner's entry to the Sonic the Hedgehog series. That includes story-wise with Shadow the Hedgehog as a character. I've seen people discussing how much of the story felt unoriginal and like a retread, and while I do believe that is true to some extent, we have to keep in mind the story's goal is to reintroduce people to Shadow as a character. So does it do just that? Honestly, yeah, it does it basically pretty good. Like I said earlier, it isn't perfect. There are some minor lore problems here and there, but overall this is a good introduction for Shadow as a character after nearly 15 years of absence in the games, when he used to be basically the second main character in the series. But of course, a story shouldn't just be a recap of previous events. It should advance the character and his journey. Sonic Heroes was effectively in this same exact position. That game also did offer a new introduction as Shadow as a character. Of course, it's not to the same degree as it is in this game. In Heroes, they had to reintroduce every single character, including the Chaotix, retroactively retconning the original game. But in Shadow Generations, we get to focus on exclusively Shadow as a character. But Heroes managed to, within its short amount of 30-minute cutscenes, it did a good job of forwarding Shadow's story. Does this game also do that? Does it forward Shadow's story and execute a great story? Honestly, yeah. First of all, this story does have relatively good pacing and setup, but my main issue is that the whole thing just comes across as cheap to me. Like it's trying to force something out of me, but it really doesn't, which I'll get to later. The main thing this story sets up is Black Doom's powers and how they influence Shadow. Shadow gets increasingly more angry throughout the story. The progression of that is there, and Shadow's bloodlust to get rid of the Black Arms is there. My main point is that it just isn't that interesting to me. Look, I'm not asking for The Godfather Part 3, the real one, with my Sonic stories. Of course, Shadow Generations of all games, I'm not expecting to have anything special with its story, but I was hoping for some more cutscenes. Many people have mentioned that this game's story is the opposite of Shadow of 5, being that the past is an important part of who we are and that we shouldn't ignore it. The game, again, has amazing ideas with its story, including a great character arc and developments for Shadow the Hedgehog as a character. My main issue is that there's so little in the game's cutscenes that you didn't really get what the game was trying to get across to you all that well. And for people saying that a short story is fine, yeah, I perfectly agree. Heroes' runtime in terms of cutscenes is on a similar length to Shadow Generations, but whereas that game was trying to remain simple and not really trying to tell anything too complex, Shadow Generations is also remaining simple to an extent and not trying to remain complex, but the thing is there are some more complex things going on here that the game doesn't really convey to you all that well. Like I said, the game has a main point here, but it doesn't really do the best job at communicating it well. Again, my main issue here isn't the characterization or anything. My main issue is there just isn't a lot going on here in the game's main cutscenes. The game is trying to tell this super emotional story and the ending is supposed to get me all sad, but honestly I just felt nothing. It really didn't get much of a reaction out of me because I can't help but think this felt really basic and kind of forced. Again, there is a story here, there is a character arc, and there are good themes, but the game never conveys it to you that well. If you want to understand the game's full stories, you need to read all the NPC dialogue, the journal, and watch the prologue animation. Well, I'm glad that these are in, the actual game this time. Most people are going to skip over all this stuff, and it'll fly over people's heads. On my first playthrough, I didn't even see much of the NPC dialogue, or bother myself with reading the Gerald's journal. I did that before my 4th playthrough of the game. Maybe I'm overreacting here, but that's not to say that this story doesn't have the sauce. It has the sauce, they just forgot to put it on the pizza. I will say, the best part of this game's entire story across its promotional material and the game's main cutscenes is the Gerald Robotnik journal. You can be jealous now because I have this tiny thing physically. But yeah, there are some insane lore cuts here. I was seriously surprised to see what they did here. Honestly, I actually got a little emotional reading that last page of the journal. It seriously did a great job to help recontextualize so many things in even the game and added a lot of depth to the Robotnik family. And of course, recently we've even found out that they're considering an Eggman spin-off game where they explore Eggman's family. And honestly, go for it. I mean, we've just opened the floodgates with this journal. They might as well just go all in. My biggest word of advice to anyone going in to play this game: play Sonic Generations first, but skip all of its cutscenes, then watch Dark Beginnings, then read the journal, and make sure to read all the NPC dialogue while playing the game. There are some genuinely memorable moments in this game's story itself, though, like the entire Mephiles fight, especially leading up to it. I love the atmosphere and the closed-off nature of the location of the fight. It's something that Generations never got to utilize with white space just being a menu. Now would be probably a good time to talk about the game's boss fights. Yeah, this is a Sonic game, which means we have really bad boss fights. However, To Shadow Generation's credit, the bosses aren't actually that bad and have some pretty cool things going on here. For one, I'm glad they don't just straight up copy the original boss fights. They actually add more to the bosses or just straight up have completely new ones. Bio Lizards is fine. It definitely feels really plain and simple. There is some nice spectacle here, but aside from that, I really don't find much special going on with this fight here. It just feels like the original fight, but longer. Neo Metal Sonic, on the other hand, is great. It feels like you're playing a level. Also, the S rank here is surprisingly pretty tight. Like, you have to do everything right if you want to get that S rank. S ranks in this game are pretty easy to get, aside from this one for some reason. It took even longer for me in hard mode. But I will say, this fight does leave a lot to be desired. I feel like it is a bit too simple and they cut corners in a lot of areas. It feels like the entire fight just amounts to press L and press R and occasionally jump. But aside from that, it's not really a lot much more going on. Mephiles, on the other hand, is kind of bad. It just sort of bored me. The sheer atmosphere and dialogue that Mephiles gave really did carry the whole thing. Not only did Mephiles have the easiest boss, but it was also the most simple. There's not a lot going on here I'd say I would enjoy or remember for any particular reason. Devil Doom and Neo Devil Doom is definitely the best boss here. Remember what I said about that Neo Metal Sonic boss fight feeling like you're playing an actual level? Yeah, this just cranks it up by like 50. There is surprisingly a lot to do. It creates a good balance between spectacle and gameplay. Well, when it comes to the spectacle aspect, they quite literally ruin the aspect ratio here in this final cutscene here. How does this keep happening? Briefly, Shadow Generations has way better and more engaging boss fights that don't keep me sitting around like other previous Sonic games did with their boss. While its final boss is definitely way higher than the original Sonic Generations, some of its bosses aren't as fun as the original Generations, and I might say, overall, those were better. Oh, speaking of the original Sonic Generation, of course, they made some changes to Sonic Generations, for better or for worse. They added these Chao mission things, where basically you rescue Chao, and some of them are also added to the birthday party cutscenes. Anyways, I found a good number of these Chao. As for what finding these Chao does, nothing. But hey, I guess it's whatever. It gives me an excuse to play the game more. Also, they added the drop dash because yes, the drop dash is goated, but they added it for modern Sonic, which felt useless. But why does it cost skill points for classic Sonic to use it? Which means you can't use the drop dash in time attack. So, in order to, you know, not screw up my memory, I'm just not gonna use the drop dash. Not much to say about Sonic Generations other than that incredibly controversial rewrite. And yeah, they have added in new dialogue changes to the game. But to be honest, I really don't care. Sonic Generations was a game that I recommended people to skip all the game's cutscenes anyways. And the rewrite really hasn't changed that. Now, do I think the rewrite was better? Well, since the rewrite has just been inoffensive and pointless changes, a lot of the changes here really do come down to personal preferences. And to be honest, after tallying up literally every single change side by side, I like the rewrite by just 2 extra points. The only part of the rewrite that really irked me was them mentioning the time stone. Yes, I'm aware this is a game about time travel, so it would only make sense for characters to question if this has to do with a pre-established form of time travel in the series. But the thing is, in Sonic CD, Sonic never used the time stones for travel. Yes, the time stones did manipulate time, but they didn't travel. The flagpole things were. But yeah. And I've also seen a lot of discussion about Amy Rose's characterization, and all I gotta say, y'all, get used to it, because this is one of the changes in characterization that is probably never gonna change. This version of Amy is unfortunately here to stay, so yeah. But yeah, overall overall really good remaster, though it unfortunately turned out to be relatively glitchy in nature. I encountered quite a few glitches while replaying Sonic Generations, and one where the game just straight up didn't have audio, like, at all during the cutscene. Like, I mean, seriously, none of the cutscenes had their voice lines played. I don't even know what caused it. Just as a heads up though, I am playing on Japanese voices. Yeah. Let's end off the video with this. Shadow Generations is easily the best Sonic game since Sonic Generations. Not a high bar, but whatever. It's a great game and I'll easily be playing it often. While this isn't the peak of 3D Sonic by any means, and we certainly have some places to go before we reach there, Shadow Generations is placing a seal in which I hope to see more Shadow the Hedgehog games. Because what does this represent for the future? Could you imagine it like this? We consistently get lighthearted, fun stories that don't take themselves too seriously with the RSS Classic Sonic games, grand, epic, adventure/open zone type games that are incredibly character focused with the big, modern Sonic games, and dark, lore heavy, boost styled games with Shadow Generations. I'm excited to see where they head next, and if they decide to do more Shadow games. But I think we need an evolution of the boost gameplay to push it further. These 3 types of Sonic games really could fill up the years with much Sonic content, because we don't have to be tied down to just these 3 types of Sonic games. There's much more stuff we can discuss.